everyone. So this session is changing gears a little bit. We've been talking about biomarkers a lot, and now we're going to switch to patient-focused drug development. And specifically, we're talking about the roadmap and how to navigate it. For those of you who don't know what the roadmap is, I'm going to get into that in a minute. As part of the session, we're also going to talk about the rare disease clinical outcome assessment resource, and that's just going to be an example of one way that we can navigate that roadmap. Where do I point? There we go. So we have a fantastic panel today. I'm so excited to be joined by Michelle Campbell and Naomi Noble from the FDA, Dima Martini-Drew from Astellas, Allison Moore from the Hereditary Neuropathy Foundation, and my colleague, Lindsay Murray. So what is patient-focused drug development? It's kind of a buzzy word, but it really has meaning underneath it. The definition is a systematic approach to help ensure that patients' experiences, perspectives, needs, and priorities are captured and meaningfully incorporated in the development and evaluation of medical products throughout the medical product life cycle. So we've talked about biomarkers. We need to understand kind of what's happening underlying. However, the symptoms, the functioning, how people are living and feeling is really important and a piece of the puzzle that we need to understand. I feel like biomarkers and clinical outcomes themselves, they have to feed off of each other. We can't focus on one without realizing what the other one is. So we're going to focus on that for the next hour today. So patient-focused drug development, it came out of the 21st Century Cures Act of 2016 and PDUFA 6. They specified that the FDA would develop a series of guidances regarding the collection of patient experience data and the use of patient experience data in drug development. So we now have 4 guidances that have come out from this series. 2 are final, 2 are tiptoeing towards final. And the one that I want to draw attention to today is guidance number 3. This is on selecting, developing, or modifying fit-for-purpose COAs. It describes the evidence that's needed to justify the use of a COA in assessing the concept of interest in a specific context of use. So those are 2 words. You've already heard Klaus mention context of use today. That is such a critical word for us to be focused on because that's how we know something is fit for the purpose that we intend to use it for. So in this guidance, we do have a roadmap to patient-focused outcome measures for use by sponsors and COA developers. So let's look at that roadmap. And this is, like I said, this is from the draft guidance from 2022. I've been presenting this pretty much every week since I joined CPAC a year and a half ago, and you've probably seen me talk about this roadmap before, and I have a feeling it's not going to look like this in the final. I don't know, but just because I'm so used to it, it would make sense that it changes, and then I have to adjust to that. But I think the themes, I'm assuming they will still be the same. We start on the left-hand side, and first we need to understand the disease or the condition that we're trying to measure, we're trying to treat, we're trying to help. So there's a lot of different sources that we can go to for that. We can go directly to the patients and asking them, how are you feeling and functioning? What does your daily life look like? And what should we be focusing on that's going to make an impact for you? We can look at natural history studies to understand the course of the disease. We can look at what the healthcare environment looks like today. Where are the unmet needs? Where are the gaps that we should be trying to fill? And then, of course, there's a wide range of stakeholders that we should also be considering. Healthcare perspectives, providers, payers, caregivers. So by looking at that landscape and understanding the condition itself, then we can start to narrow down into how are we going to measure the things that are meaningful to the people with these experiences. We need to identify the concept of interest, the thing or the sets of things that are important to the people with that condition. And then we need to define the context of use. And that means within a clinical trial, what does the patient population look like that we're trying to recruit? The earlier session about staging. Staging is critical, understanding what the disease course looks like and who we're focusing in on. And then from there, what does the treatment look like, and what benefits might we see that we need to be thinking about in a trial setting? So then we get to the fun part. I should have introduced myself as the lead for the clinical outcome assessment program at CPATH. And this middle section is kind of the thing that we've spent our careers doing within the COA space. Figuring out how are we going to measure the things that matter to people. Is it asking them directly? Is it having a clinician rate it? Is it having them perform some sort of activity and then getting data from that activity, say from a digital health technology? And then now we get to start following the roadmap into the choose your own adventure of what's out there. Is there something that already exists that we can just take off the shelf? Maybe we're on that top line. More than likely, it might be one of the other two lines. There might be something that exists and it's a good starting place, but more work is needed on it, or perhaps nothing exists and we have to start from scratch. But no matter which of those routes we take, if we have done our due diligence along the way, at the end of the road, we get to a fit-for-purpose COA, which means that we've defined the context of use and the concept of interest clearly. We have a clear rationale for why we've chosen this path, and we've generated sufficient evidence to justify that rationale. Not just data, the actual evidence where we're weaving the story together and coming up with this conclusion. So one example that I want to share that is a method or an approach to diving into the roadmap is specific to rare diseases, where we don't have a huge population to be able to go out and speak to and sample from and collect data and do all the psychometric testing that I would love to do. So Lindsay and her team have developed a starting place specifically for rare diseases, which is the Rare Disease COA resource. It provides information on published COAs that have the potential to be used to support efficacy endpoints in treatment trials for rare diseases. So I have a little image of this roadmap down in the right-hand corner and a yellow circle around the section where this COA resource is really going to be helpful. You still have to understand the background of the disease and understand the things that you know you need to be measuring in this patient population. But once you've done that work, you can dive on into that yellow circle there and maybe leverage things that other people have done so that we're not starting from scratch every single time, because we just don't have time to do that. With that, I want to hand it over to the panel, and I do want to start with Lindsay. If you could tell us about why you developed the Rare Disease COA resource and how can it be used?
Sure. Actually, if you want to put the last slide up, that would be helpful.
But nobody taught me how to do that one. Backward.
So the Rare Disease COA resource really came about because, especially in rare diseases, finding a COA that really measures precisely what you're using can be really difficult to identify. And a lot of small biopharma companies that are working in early rare disease development, they don't have big outcomes departments that can really help guide selection of the tools they're going to use as their efficacy endpoints. And so, sometimes they get led astray. A clinician says, oh, you should use this tool that I wrote on the back of this napkin, and that becomes the guiding post for that disease area. But it doesn't meet any of the regulatory benchmarks. So we really wanted to create a space where information around COAs that has been evaluated by COA development experts, experts in clinic, experts in regulatory space have all looked at these COAs and said, we think these are the best of what's available, and start looking here. So we started in pediatric, rare, non-oncologic patient populations. When we came together initially, that was very clearly from industry, from regulators. Everybody said, this is where we are struggling the most. To find tools, to interpret these tools, what are we doing here? So we started there. We focused initially on aspects of daily functioning. So we looked at gross motor function, fine motor function, self-care, and communication and language. And we really picked those domains based on feedback we got from working with patient advocacy groups and caregivers telling us this is what's important to our families, this is what's impacting our lives on a day-to-day basis. And those are aspects that treatment can really dramatically improve. So we started there and have identified the tools that, and this is not a pick it off the shelf now and put it in your trial. We've identified the 15 best tools that measure self-care that are available now. And we've collected all the psychometric evidence that's available for those tools. Many of them were developed in non-rare conditions, but you still have that body of evidence. And then certainly if there were tests done in rare disease populations, we've also collected that data and made it all available publicly from the database so that sponsors can actually just pull that data and put it into your COA dossier as you're working on your submissions. And the hope is really, you're still going to have to, it's not going to be, as I said, it's not a off the shelf, put it in, this is going to be FDA endorsed right away. That's not what this is. You still have to think about, matching the tools. We included an age ranges from 2 to 18, I think most of the tools cover, some 0, but so if your kids are in the 2 to 4 age, mostly, you're going to want to pick a tool that measures self-care at 2 to 4 versus at 18. We have different expectations of what they could do. So again, you have to think carefully about what tool you want to use, but we've done a lot of the heavy lifting in terms of evaluating those COAs, and as I said, we have the COA expertise within the Rare Disease COA Consortium. We brought in advisory panels, had physical therapists, speech language pathologists, occupational therapists help us review these tools, see what made sense, and that's what we've included in this resource to really try to level the field a bit for folks who are coming into drug development space and don't know where to start. This is a great starting point. All of that information is now publicly available for those 4 domains. We're currently in the background working on pain and sleep, because those are also important concepts that cover many, many rare diseases. So we're working on that for pediatric populations. And so we'll be releasing a new expansion of the resource as soon as those analyses are done. And then we're also going to launch into fatigue next. So there's a lot of work going on. We're trying to build the resource as quickly as possible within the constraints of how many of us there are to review these COAs. But we're really excited about it.
Thanks, Lindsay. It's really exciting to know that that's out there. It's publicly available. Anybody can go during your lunch break to look on there to see what's out there. I want to expand this a little bit. We've focused in on one way to navigate the roadmap, but I want to turn to Naomi and Michelle now about what are sponsors getting right when they're looking in rare disease and they're trying to navigate patient-focused drug development. What are you seeing that is really encouraging? I'll start with you, Naomi, if that's good.
Sure thing. There are 3 things that we see as again, I wish, maybe we just all need the roadmap tattooed, or we need to start wearing t-shirts of it. It's a thought. Next panel, guys.
The far left, figure 2.
There we go. One thing is being specific about what it is that's being measured. There's one side of the spectrum that's, well, it has something to do with the body. And then there's the other side of the spectrum that says, yes, we're measuring the severity of pain, or we're measuring the duration of this particular symptom, or we're measuring this specific developmental milestone because it's so critical to what we understand about the natural history of this disease and condition. The second thing that we see people doing right and well is using several types of clinical outcome assessments instead of just one type. Sometimes, especially for, you can go heavy into a clinician-reported outcome, for example, which has its own strengths and limits and may not necessarily be the right evidence for all stakeholders. And so integrating potentially observer-reported outcomes might also be helpful to round out that picture. As regulators, we're looking at the totality of evidence, and that may be a somewhat blurry term, but it really does mean we're looking at everything that is coming to us in a package, in a submission. And so having multiple sources of evidence really helps round out that picture. So sponsors who are doing a great job of looking at clinician-reported as well as observer-reported, maybe some DHTs. It's great to see that kind of rich evidence. And then the third thing is, I guess you could use the term test drive. Sponsors who test drive their measurement approach before putting it into a pivotal clinical trial. And to hear me say that, it might sound, I don't know, obvious or maybe extreme, but I wish I could say I was violating confidentiality, but we have seen time and time again a brand new measurement approach being launched in a pivotal trial for a rare disease with no treatments available, and the company didn't have either the bandwidth, the time, or whatever to find out what the scores looked like for that patient population. And lo and behold, everyone is at the floor, or everyone's already at the ceiling. And so there wasn't that opportunity in advance to find out how do we enrich our trial perhaps for the right patient population, or what else could we be measuring together with this one outcome. So yeah, those are the three pieces of wisdom: getting specific, multiple types of measures, and test driving or pilot testing measurement. Yeah, Michelle.
Sure. So I have this unique and odd viewpoint because I started my career at the agency in what is now the division of COA. So I was that measurement person and transitioned to neuroscience a couple years ago. And so it's taking what I know in measurement and blending it with what is the everyday life of that review division, right? Because we're balancing, not just the measurement. We're balancing a safety profile. We're balancing what does the biomarker suggest to us that something's working, and how's that align with what we're seeing in our clinical outcome assessments? How do we optimize our COA selection to support this broad endpoint where I may only have one opportunity to really get that trial done, right? And I think where I am seeing successes is because we have been putting out there about patient-focused drug development for the last decade or so, is the desire from the patient communities to be a part of that PFDD spectrum, right? And I'm going to talk a little bit about that more tomorrow, about what that is, because there's opportunities throughout the drug development spectrum. I think as Dr. Stein, Dr. Califf said today, we are just one stakeholder in drug development. And so where I do think how patient-focused drug development plays an interplay with that is that we need our other stakeholders to help us be able to select as optimally as possible and come in early and have those conversations, as Dr. Bracco said, because then we can actually put collectively together, think about what are our endpoint approaches. So where we are seeing things that maybe working better is when we do get that early engagement. So when we say early and often, you hear us say that a lot. I should wear a pin that says that, right? And I think people just kind of chuckle about that, like, oh yeah, they say that, right? But do they really mean it? Well, no, I really do mean it, right? I don't say things because I don't mean it, right? And we mean it because we know that we're gonna have a better opportunity to help either think through to suggested study trial design that you're proposing, because we can leverage actually our expertise from what else we're seeing, right? So I may not be able to talk about specific other programs, but I can take what I'm seeing in general, maybe in a disease space, and apply that and think about it, or say, oh, we kind of know what you need to think about because maybe we've seen how this played out in a way and we have lessons learned. So that early and often is really important. So I think that's a thing I'm seeing. Trying to operationalize the patient-focused drug development series. I know they're daunting, I get it. But there are some really great key points, and I think the roadmap is something to ground in. I mention all the time, it is figure 2. And I think why it is so critically important to root ourselves in the roadmap is we know in rare disease, unfortunately, we have big holes, right, with some of the data, the natural history. What if we've had something that now has the genetic test, and so I'm no longer part of this family disease, I'm now my own entity, and my natural history is gonna look different, and I now have to begin that process. And so I think if we can root ourselves in the roadmap, it will help guide the conversation for drug development.
Thank you both. I was just thinking there that the the lessons learned and learning from what's happening in other spaces. That's really a plug for consortia-led efforts, public-private partnerships, where the different voices can come together and share those learnings and grow together rather than just staying in your insular silos and not being able to learn from what others have done. So thank you for that plug. I want to actually ask the same question to you, Dima. You're representing the sponsor side of things. So what are you all getting right, and what's kind of leading towards good interactions and good successes on your end?
Well, some of the things that we are getting right is that I'm here.
Yeah.
And we have been a member of the clinical outcome assessments for rare diseases from the start. And I think we had wonderful successes, and there are now even some task forces that are coming out of that for gene therapy and for video clinical outcome assessment, and we are members of that. So I think that's, believe me, a change in the thinking of many industry partners and our company itself. We're also thinking about the future, and now that we learned that this is a possibility. So, for example, we have one development that's happening for Alexander disease in partnership with the University of Massachusetts, and I'm planning to discuss it with Colin to hopefully start a public-private partnership and hopefully identify treatment or more for the patients with Alexander disease. Yeah, also we have, like from the beginning, I don't know if Alex Betourné is here, but we worked with him on the colleagues from a department in our company worked on the Friedreich ataxia patients to look at gait and if there is a way that they can produce an application that can function as a clinical outcome assessment or probably early detection tool. And I think it did not succeed, but that is a success because failing quickly is the best way to fail, right? Instead of wasting so much resources like we did in other circumstances, like we did not follow that paradigm. And if you claim to be patient-centric, and if you claim to be sustainable, you cannot fail that. And this is one of the things that we're probably not doing great is as employees of the company in different departments, it's not easy to convince our sponsors that the investment need to happen and that the drug development is not a clinical trial in general, but especially in rare diseases. So we are going to continue to advocate and to continue because initially what we want to do, all of us, is to develop a treatment for patients with rare diseases and that this is possible and there's no barrier between the different stakeholders like all of you really already mentioned. We are all in it together and that is also a little bit still slowly happening.
I'm going to go off script for a minute, if that's okay, because you just said the investment isn't there, that's kind of a big hurdle. What's going to move the needle on that? Is this
our
kind of
failure.
The failure?
Our failure, the fact that we ran into a clinical trial without doing the right job.
So learning from the...
And the waste of the carer's time,
Yeah.
the patient's time.
Yeah.
This is the most important sustainable source. And then you take the patients out of a clinical drug development because most of clinical drug development studies don't allow you to be doing 2 studies in parallel. It's like, that's a huge waste, huge waste.
Yeah. So learning from successes, learning from failures, but just paying attention.
Indeed.
And actually listening to the data that are showing up at your door.
Yeah, and I think there's also something very crucial at this time, and it's been happening, and it's interesting to see that the regulators have advanced and the industry is playing catch-up, where it used to be the opposite, if I may say. And that evolution takes time, and the reality that we need to unlearn what we learned and relearn something that will be done differently, this is the only way to accelerate. Otherwise, we will stagnate.
Not just copying and pasting. Yeah.
And have to be done new. Even though you give us wonderful roadmap and everything, but in patient, in human, there's no standard. So there's no way that one size will fit all. So we will have to always redo it and always think about it as a crazy idea, because without crazy idea, there will not be a jump ahead.
Cheryl, can I just add something on what Demi just said, is actually learning from our failures or losses are actually our best learning opportunities. It's not just our successes. That means we got it right. But how did we get there? Is we probably learn from our failures first. And so I think that is really important for us to remember when we're in this space in drug development, that they're going to happen, right? And I know for patient communities that's extremely hard. And I hear it, I get it, and I joke, I say, well, what I really want is to retire, because that means we have treatments and cures for everyone's diseases, right? And we're out of business, and we've got that solved. But I think learning from that, and I think what it also leads is in two ways. So one way we can do that when you come early and often, so we can think about it with designs, because I think where we want to be innovative, we can be. And I think Dr. Cavazzoni was highlighting opportunities where we're trying to internally leverage our internal expertise in areas of innovation in rare disease. And so that's why coming in and having these conversations so we can think about this. The other thing is this is why data sharing is so important, right? Because we actually learn the most from those failed data pieces, right? And so where there's opportunities such as RD-COA DAP to data share, those are really important. Your placebo arms, your active trial arms, those are so important for us to be able to learn in the pre-competitive space by pulling the data together. And we know in rare disease, numbers is our problem. We don't have the numbers, right? That is like our number one challenge, period. One of our many challenges, but we know when we're trying to design things. But if we can pull data together, maybe in a family disease or enough from various different data sets, that's only going to benefit the greater good. It's only going to help, and maybe then it will help with the investment of why we need to contribute and collectively work together to really advance rare disease drug development.
Thanks, Michelle. Allison, I want to turn to you now. You're here both representing yourself as a patient, but representing the advocacy space. You have experience speaking up for patients and also designing trials and kind of navigating. I mean, you're wearing a lot of hats here. So pick a hat. You can take one off and put another one on as you answer this. But what is your experience with measuring meaningful outcomes in clinical trials? What are you seeing there? And do you have successes to talk about there or failures that we can learn from?
I usually like to talk about successes, but I'm going to give you the roadmap. So in 2010, we funded our very first study, What It's Like to Live with CMT. Charcot-Marie-Tooth disease is a chronic progressive neuromuscular disease, and it was a quantitative, qualitative study for those that know it best. And it was really eye-opening, even as a patient and a caregiver, to see things that I was not aware of. So fast forward, it evolved to a robust, comprehensive patient registry where we learned even more about the patient community and the gaps, such as proprioception, severe gait disturbances, pain, really activities of daily living, things that are just so challenging, fatigue being one. I'm glad that you're working on that. And we just kept disseminating this information at professional conferences, talking to the KOLs, talking to industry, and no one was really listening to us. I don't think they realized that we really have the power that we need to educate and start thinking about developing these pilot studies that actually could show that we really do need to address these issues. We have 2 failed clinical trials, and this is a very serious matter. So people really weren't listening. So last year we decided to take matters into our own hands, and we found some innovators in the case of clinical outcome assessments, and we developed a pilot study where we could actually capture proprioception, frequent falls, severe gait disturbances, mostly remote and frequent collection of data at home, at school, at work, and the results look very promising. So we were very fortunate to connect with CPAP, thanks to Klaus, And this public-private partnership is very intriguing to me, and I think we're doing something right, because I wouldn't be here today. And I'm really looking forward to moving the needle, not just for Charcot-Marie-Tooth disease, but many rare and common diseases that need to figure this out, because I'm really worried there's going to be a lot more failed trials if we don't address this. So I'm just thrilled to be here, and I think we're onto something, and we have other things in the works that may come up on the next question, but I hope I answered it, and I look forward to talking to anybody in the room if you want to learn more about what we're doing and how we can help others.
Thanks, Allison.
Thank you.
Can I ask you?
Sure.
You know, from the FDA side, it sometimes feels really tricky to convey to sponsors, this is why a pilot test is worth your time and resources. And I sometimes worry that sponsors are like, well, you're just asking me to light more money on fire. You know, we can do that in much more enriching ways. But can you speak to what were some of the points that incentivized you all to feel like a pilot study was worthwhile, and what advice would you give to sponsors in really any rare disease space?
So I learned from you today, that's going to be my new term, test drive. Yeah. Pre-competitive test drive, right? We need the sponsors to come together, just like we're doing with exploratory biomarker work. We need to do this because I think it's backwards. They're spending hundreds of millions of dollars. Pilot test it. It's not a lot if we come together to do it. And it helps FDA, it helps all the stakeholders. And then we could show if this potential technology that we're working with can work, or some of the other ones we're working with, and others out there. So kudos to all of you guys. And I think that that would really accelerate drug development and ensure that trials will be successful, because we heard on one of the other panels that, and I think it was one of the FDA doctors, one of the folks that said, these trials are failing for the wrong reasons. Some of these adverse events are not really adverse events. So this, if we do this, we're minimizing and de-risking the potential success of clinical trials. So thank you for asking me that. And I think we all together have to really push. And I think working closely with Klaus and CPATH and FDA, I think we can accomplish that, because there's a lot of people in this room that want the same things that we do. So thank you for asking.
And may I add one thing, please? There's no other way. If there's another way, we would have considered it, but there isn't another way. We don't know about the diseases, and there's a natural history of a disease that never had a treatment. But once there's a treatment, the natural history of the disease is very different from before having treatment. And then if you think about a disease like the most common disease probably, 100 years ago, it used to be studied in the cadaver. And if it wasn't for the insulin, they would have stayed the cadavers. So there wouldn't be a natural history of the disease. So when there's a treatment, without a treatment, if a disease will kill you, the patient, they're all rare. So how will you know what to measure without doing the pilot that you need to do, without speaking with the patient and the patient's organization? You also, who do you want to please, if you know what I mean? I mean, it's like, I remember a very long time ago, I was still a child, wasn't even studying medicine. And I was with my father when he discovered he had high cholesterol level, and the doctor was his best friend. And after giving him statins, and the cholesterol came down, and then he told him, I'm very, very happy, Dr. Martini, because your cholesterol is under control. And Dad told him, so you're happy, how about me? I would have been happier not knowing that I have a high cholesterol level. And that is crucial if we think about the patient is not a measurement, is not even a clinical outcome assessment. More importantly, the caregiver and the caregiver's disease, because they surely, I mean, I imagine when I have flu, I am down, and today I have jet lag, I am not well. I just imagine how do they cognitively function, the caregiver, when they have a life sentence like that, if they don't see the future. So we have to give them hope, and without pilot testing, there won't be hope because we will end up failing again and again and again.
So I think what you're also highlighting in a way is the translational science piece that Dr. Cavazzoni was talking about, right? We still know that is critically important. We get a little bit more of it in our larger diseases, quote unquote, right? Because every disease has heterogeneity, no matter what. But we have a better ways. We've been doing it maybe a little bit longer in our larger diseases, but we know in our rare diseases that is where our challenges run, because it's sometimes not completely done, right? Because we want to get things out to patients because we know they need treatments and therapies. But at the same time, the end part of that translational science is getting us into that PFDD world, right? And so we have to make sure that we remember to have that sufficient information into that, to your point, so we have that better understanding. What are the right things to measure? What is maybe the target therapy? You know, if we're trying to do a very directed therapy, we have to have those biological underpinnings to help us. So we then are selecting these right things, and then how do we balance what are the right things to actually measure, right? So I think one of the struggles we hear sometimes in rare disease drug development is, you know I can probably, I spend half my days talking to patient groups and caregivers, and I hear their stories, and I could probably surmise the top 5 things about everyone once, right? Because it's all the same, right? The different lived experience is going to be different, but we all want similar things. We also have to balance is what do we think the therapy is actually going to do, right? And so sometimes we have to have these conversations of really trying to, when we get things that come in for review, where we're saying, well, we want to measure these 5 things, but I'm like, is my therapy actually going to hit all 5 of those things? Or am I actually missing something of what I'm measuring that I think is actually going to be what's changing? And so we need to find this balance. Is kind of, I remember when I took one of my basic statistics class decades ago, right? It's like a balance of the art and the science, right? So I have to balance what we hear that families want from their lived experience. In no way do I want to diminish that at all, because that is critically important, because in the end, I'm supposed to be writing something, improving something for that person, right? When we make a positive decision. At the same time, I really am hopeful that we've had that good translational science and that good understanding of what we think will be able to likely to change. And with this evolution in therapies where we're trying to go broad, like we're trying to do the entire disease area, that is why we really have to have these critical conversations of how do we accurately select the concepts to measure, and then go into how am I going to actually measure these things? And that's to Naomi's point about, well, we may need multiple approaches on how to measure these things. Because in the end, I'm going to look at every single thing, and that's going to tell me the better story of that trial and what really happened and what is that lived experience type scenario. So I think where I'm hearing is this, we're maybe highlighting different things, but together what that balance is how do we take the important need of our translational science and how that gets us into being able to do patient-focused drug development.
100%.
And I would just jump in and say, I think one of the things that's been really, to me, just mind-blowing in the Rare Disease COA Consortium is we've been trying to identify these domains that are of high priority to patients and regulators, and really we're doing these assessments, what's available, but we're actually also doing a gap analysis of like, where are we not finding good measurement tools, and having that opportunity to have regulators sitting by, sponsors to be like, okay, we're not measuring this well. We're gonna need to do something different. So I know in our consortium, cognition, I think, is one that comes to the top of everybody's mind when everybody wants cognition to be improved. And it kept coming up in our rare disease conversations. Where should we take the resource? And everyone was like, cognition. And everybody was like, let's take a breath. Let's think about that. Maybe let's pick a lower hanging fruit.
Let's not go for the hardest one out there.
Right. Like, I can wrap my head around gross motor function. Cognition's maybe a little bit bigger. But we have come to the point where we were talking about where should we expand the resource, and cognition kept coming up, and we all said we had a chance to talk with each other and be like, let's be honest. If I go out and review the COAs that are being used to measure cognition now, we all know they're flawed deeply. We know they're not working in the rare disease space. How about, instead of including those in the resource, knowing they're just going to limp along and we're not moving the science forward, we're actually, we've created a scoping committee to create a new project where we're going to look at how do we measure cognition in rare disease patient populations, and what is the work we're going to need to do to actually make that useful, because we want to measure these topics that are important to families, and maybe we can figure out how to do that without needing 10 years worth of data, you know, or maybe we can do it in a way that really reflects what the children with rare disease are able to do, and do it in a multinational setting, because, you know, a lot of these IQ tests include vocabulary. Well, is dog the same level of, you know, vocabulary in English versus in Thai versus in Russian? Like,
Arabic.
often not. So really trying to think through, how do we measure in children, you know, tiny people who can't always respond to us, they can't always do what we ask them to do, and think about that better. And I feel like that's been a real opportunity for my consortium to say, we're going to move the science forward here, because what we have is not working and we need to improve it. And we've heard from patient advocates, and we've heard from pharma, and we've heard from regulators, like, there are some concepts that are so crucial and we are just measuring them poorly. So we have to do better. We have to move it forward. And
to speak to the theme, I think, of our panel, the theme of this whole conference, it's the pre-competitive partnership space that allows us to do that so well, right? We can bring in patient advocates, we can bring in our NIH colleagues, we can bring in FDA, EMA, all of our biotech and sponsor members, right? And it's so important, and then leverage what's within CPATH already to bring to bear on the question. It's really powerful.
And I struggle a little bit with the word competition in the rare disease space specifically, because what does it mean really? It's not like you're selling, say, an optional quality of life. Say I want to have, instead of stevia, instead of sucralose, for example. There's no creating a need. So what is it about the competitive space, and why can't we, even in the competitive space, sit down together and discuss the same way, if the objective is really the patient? And I mean, with all, with not to demine or to say it's not important, of course, without the commercial return on investment, there will not be investment in any new therapies. But if we want to succeed in treating the patient, which will eventually reflect, but why do we compete on something so crucial and important? There's no, I don't.
Dima, I wish I could answer that.
It doesn't really.
As a consultant who developed COAs, I cannot tell you how many cough diaries
Yeah.
I developed.
Yeah.
Someone reviews
migraine
multiple of the
diaries.
same thing.
Another cough diary. Yeah.
But I think what's been really, I think one of the strengths of CPATH is because it's this pre-competitive space, it allows the lawyers at pharma companies to kind of breathe a little bit and like, okay, no one's asking me to, provide my confidential information on like what our drug pipeline is and what the mechanisms of action will be. We're able to really just talk theoretically about things, which I think, just from my experience consulting, the companies are not talking to each other about their cough.
I know too well that. Yeah, I know that too well.
And that's in a bigger disease. COPD, yes, I can stand on the corner and find enough patients, but in rare disease especially, like we just can't let that be the barrier to getting this work done. Yeah.
Can I ask Allison a question?
1 second.
Sure.
I just want to let the audience know, lunch is around the corner, so there is hope in sight. But we do have runners with microphones, and I would love to see them sprinting through the audience to help you guys ask us questions. So if you do have a question or a comment based on your experience and maybe how what barriers you might be running into or whatever, raise your hand, they'll come to you. Michelle, I'll turn it to you.
Yeah, so Allison, I have a question for you. And so I obviously know a little bit about CMT, and I've spent time with the hereditary neuropathy Foundation, but I was hoping for this audience, if you can talk about, as you mentioned, it's a slowly progressive neuromuscular disease, but you also have folks that are diagnosed at different points in their life. And so their progression is going to look different depending on when they were diagnosed and that impaired on that function and, what are their needs. Can you talk about the experience from the foundation perspective of why it is kind of important to make sure we're capturing that entire broad spectrum, but also particularly when it comes to thinking about the different ways we may be able to try to measure those things depending on where you are in that progression?
So it's very, very challenging. We have 130 different variations, mutations, and within the mutations, there's different variants. And I think there was a disservice done to our community many years ago when it was kind of labeled as an adult disease. And I always say it starts in utero, right? It's a genetic disease primarily. And depending on the subtype, it could be devastating at birth and even at the age of 2, 3, 4 years old. They're already wearing leg braces. Sometimes there is intellectual disability. I didn't mention earlier that often and we end up with wrist drop and very severe hand and upper limb problems, which nobody ever talked about, and it's often with children. So they're in school, they're not able to play PE, they have issues with writing, and as you know, we advocate now a little bit better for non-bullying, and there's more education in the schools, but for many years there weren't. So we developed the patient registry in 2013, and we bucket it as the common subtypes, and then we get into a micro level on the more rare types. So we have ultra rare, rare, and common. I guess those are the 3 terms these days. I think there's micro rare now. There's a lot of different terminologies. But so we've been able to do a very good job bucketing that and taking the different variants, and even to go a step further, some are demyelinating, some are axonal, but they both are axonal really because it affects the axons. So that's been challenging. Some of them are mitochondria, some aren't, so we've been able to bucket those together. So what we're doing is we're kind of separating them into buckets for ages like 0 to 5, 5 to 18, and then adults. And we may even have a subset in between because, as we all know, when you have a disability, often you see your pediatrician or pediatric neurologist or healthcare provider as maybe as late as age 30 because you get very attached to your physician. So to answer your question, we've done a very good job in getting the natural history even for some of these rarer subtypes that are more severe onset. I also like to mention that patients are sometimes asymptomatic, and I was one of them. And then I had a rare cancer in my 20s. It was a sarcoma. I was given vincristine, and I had severe onset. So I became disabled in like 6 hours. I'm bringing that up because that sometimes is the severity. So there was an adverse event. So there's so many things, Michelle, to think about when we're looking at the natural history. But going back to matching the outcome assessment, whether it's observational, wearable, validated clinical scales, PROs, I do think it's really important. And when Naomi said you need a menu of everything, I think the regulatory agency is very good at handpicking what is needed. So if it's a sensory measure, it's going to look very different, right, than a motor measure. So I think we just have to keep working from an advocacy standpoint and then collaboratively so we can identify what matches with the phenotype and the genetics. And I hope I answered your question. Thank you.
Thank you. We do have a question or comment from the audience.
Thank you. My name's Kathy Collett. I'm an ALS advocate from Indianapolis, Indiana, and I'm asking this on behalf of a friend with ALS who was actually on the clinical outcomes assessment team that was related to the AMP and working through that project. So he said that it kind of disbanded, went radio silent for a while, and then more recently we saw some work that came from FDA that it was pretty much a literature search, which is lovely, but not where we kind of need to be. So can you tell us where we are with ALS on the roadmap, and then how long it takes to get to some perhaps novel COAs for a disease like ALS? Thank you.
Do you want me to answer this?
Sure thing.
Okay. Great question, Kathy. You're highlighting an effort that is going on under the Act for ALS, where we know from our ALS community that we want to make sure we're capturing the entire lived experience in our clinical trials, and really stay attuned to what is described in our ALS guidance about doing that. And so an effort underway that is continuing to be ongoing was really how do we leverage the roadmap? We talk the talk, but do we actually walk the walk? And I said, well, we're going to walk the walk. We're actually going to apply our roadmap ourselves in an effort to do this. And so one of the first things we did is I talk about, hey, remember that left side of the roadmap? We needed to start there. And so one of the things I think that, and Kathy, you're bringing up a really good point that I think sometimes we do have to have this conversation, is that what we often hear is, and we learn so much from our families, they tell us so much, is that there's stuff already been done, we've already been done. And so we need to, from a scientific into the morning conversation, what does the data tell us? What is actually in the published literature? Because we hear the same things you do too, right? And we're like, all right, well, let's see it. Like, how is this really performing? And so what we first did was we needed to really go in there and say, what is going on in the literature, right? Because that's peer reviewed, that's our way for us really to help guide, because as we've kind of talked about is, unless we're in the pre-competitive space and people are willing to share, it is often siloed with companies and we don't know what is being done, right? And so in this effort, it really identified what are concepts that are being captured, what are some of the instruments that are being used. And so what we did with that, it was, okay, that helped us identify, really trying to find what is the context of use, what are these concepts, these important concepts, and then what is likely that we think could potentially be measured in a trial, right, in a way that would have a likelihood to hopefully change through a duration of a trial. Because remember, we have to make sure that drug's actually going to change those things. And there were concepts that, while may not shift as much in a trial, are extremely clinically relevant. And I personally know when I saw some of these things, I was trying to make sure we give feedback to the clinicians to say, hey, I hope you're having these conversations, because there's things in here that are really important to clinical care and to that bridge piece of how does research go to that direction. And so what was done with that was taking the what were some of the scales that we think, let's identify where the gaps. And I think that's something we've talked about, is what are the gaps, right? Particularly in rare disease and the data. And the number one data point that was missing was that we had no qualitative work. So these scales were developed without patient and families' input. And so we don't even know if we're asking the question in the right way. And so that is really important, because you hear us talk about that a lot when we talk about COA development. And there was other things that were missing, was some of the psychometrics, some of the measurement properties. Could it actually detect change? What would be a meaningful change on this? All those things. But the fundamental thing that was really missing, which is like this critical piece in our roadmap, is we didn't have a lot of information saying that it was developed by talking to families. And so really where the next step of this effort is going to be in two ways. One is, how do we systematically get that input? Because obviously that is critically important, because we don't know if these scales are actually the questions the right way. The other piece is to put all this information out in a transparent way, and we're trying to determine what that will look like. So if anyone wants to pick up what those gaps are, you will see what the gaps are and can pick them up themselves, and can do it and maybe incorporate it into your clinical trial. And so when you do come talk to us during your IND meetings, we can have this conversation about what would be needed. So we're trying to take two approaches. We're trying to, one, get it out there, transparency and publicly, and so if a sponsor wants to pick up some of the stuff, they know what's there and what needs to be done, and then come have a conversation with us. The other piece is how can we in the pre-competitive space be able to collect some of this information to help us with one of the biggest gaps, which is talking to families. And so I would say, Kathy, to your friend who is part of that, stay tuned, because they are a critical, important component of moving this forward, because it is definitely a gap where we see that we have to account for this. It will not move good measurement forward without getting that input.
Thanks, Michelle. I think we have a question over here.
Yeah, thanks very much, panel. Tim Franson from Faegre and CPATH. And Just a question about best versus worst practices as one tries to bridge from biomarker findings to clinically important outcomes. What best and worst practice advice do the panelists have for us?
It's a great final question. We actually have 3 minutes left, so who wants to go?
Super. I'll take a stab at that first. You know, in terms of good practices, it's starting with this roadmap, understanding not just what's important to clinical experts, which is a critical piece here, but also what's important to patients and families, and then seeing what's available. Like I said earlier, getting really specific about what it is that we're measuring. Not just, oh, we're measuring something that has to do with the brain, but maybe something a little more specific, like expressive communication or, you know, short-term working memory, for example. And then pilot testing, doing that observational research like your group is doing so well, to really understand how does biomarker data map on or not map on to important clinical outcomes. And sometimes there's convergence and sometimes there isn't, but that foundational work does need to be done. And I think those would be my top 3 tips for you for good practices.
I can go next, if that's okay.
Please.
You know, patient registries have been around for a really long time, and a lot of advocacy groups have them. It's taken us a long time to get where we are. We've had a lot of reiterations of it. And I think where we're unique is we have the full picture on the patient, from the time of diagnosis, which is the typical natural history, but really capturing the psychosocial aspect, all the clinical outcome measures, patient-reported outcomes, adverse events, willingness to participate in trial, risk-benefit, plus the biospecimens now. They're now being linked into the biomarkers. And I would say that what's frustrating to me, not being a PhD or an MD, just a layman person, is we keep going back and doing the same thing over and over again. And we have to be innovative. We have to get out of ourselves as a community and try different things. Because if you're doing the same thing for 25 years and it's not working, it's never going to work. So it's time to kind of disrupt and move on. I have 1 minute, so I better move on.
All right, who wants the last word?
So I think it's interesting that Tim asked the measurement people about biomarkers, but I'm going to take your challenge, Tim, because I never back down from a good challenge. And so I think, you know, from our perspective, we know, particularly as we are trying to move earlier into disease, biomarkers will be critically important. I think this is a great example of why you want to come and talk to us early about what are you thinking your biomarker can do? What is that specific biomarker? I think everyone wants to jump immediately to the surrogate side, and you're not realizing what you actually need to evidence to actually demonstrate that in a trial. And then you're like, oh, I needed that outcome assessment because FDA said I can't do that. That biomarker's not going to work, right? And now we're scrambling to try to find that optimal COA and have no prior knowledge of what should really be work. So I think, you know, how do we bridge the science with biomarkers into the COA front? This is why we need to come talk to us early about that. Think about it. What do you think your biomarker is going to do? And then really, do I have a way to link in the biology piece, or that if it is knowledgeable of how that will translate then to that outcome, and then we can have the conversation of selecting that optimal COA.
Fantastic. I want to thank everybody for your attention, your questions, and thank the panel for their incredible perspectives. I hope we all learned something here.
Thank you, Cheryl.